Every day there's some new thing that is provocative and inhumane and that the West really hates. Was it possible that the real goal was never to capture the Ukrainian territory, but the highest goal, the real objective here, is to lure the United States and NATO to project power to send our forces into Ukraine so they can then use that 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons to achieve a final solution to the problem of the US and NATO.
Welcome to Israel News Talk Radio's program, Solomon Sword. We have a great host joining us today. I'm Rod Bryant on the program as the program director, and our host, Mariona. We'll be interviewing Dr. Peter Vincent Pry on the topic of the real and catastrophic possibility of war in Ukraine going nuclear, and that Russia is much better prepared than the US on nuclear war. Also, the consequences of a cyber attack, mass destruction, terrorism, and other threats. Dr. Peter Pry is executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security in the US. He served as a chief of staff of the Commission of EMP Commission and director of the US Nuclear Strategy Forum, and was on the staffs of the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission and the House Armed Service Committee and the CIA. He is the author of 3 amazing books: Will America Be Protected?, Blackout Warfare and Power and Light. And you can find these books anywhere on Amazon just by posting them up. And you can visit his website, emptaskforce.us, emptaskforce.us. Tamar, it's all yours. Go for it.
All right. Well, I want to welcome you to the show, Dr. Pry, and I'm excited to have you on. I want to open up with a little bit of almost like a rant, in fact, because many people, at least in my circle in Israel here and beyond, think that the Biden administration is mishandling the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. First, by not taking Russia seriously when they said that they were threatened by NATO. Second, not responding fast enough or meaningful enough with supplying weaponry and military aid to arm Ukraine forces. Rather, it has mostly been useless statements of empathy and so-called solidarity with Ukraine that, while sounding nice, doesn't fight off bullets and doesn't protect Ukrainians from Russian bombs. Sanctions haven't been much of a help either to protect Ukraine. Russia is working together now with China, and they are making their own deals, bypassing the United States. In the meantime, one of the major bread baskets of the world, the Ukraine, will not be planting this year due to the war. Russia will not be selling the all-important fertilizer for farming around the world. And already reports are coming out of new expected food shortages, hunger, and even starvation for certain populations. Inflation is growing, gas and energy prices are soaring, and to top it all off, and leading up to and even during a major war that we see taking place now, which is 2 months old already, President Biden, sadly, still doesn't even have an ambassador to the Ukraine. He's only now tapping Bridget Brink to serve as the US ambassador to Ukraine. And this is what the White House announced just yesterday on Monday. So with all of this, what many perceive, I don't know if you believe that or not, or perceive it as not, but I'd like to hear your opinion. How do you feel about how this war has broken out and is proceeding?
Well, I'm deeply worried about it every day. I wouldn't be surprised if the thing blew up into an all-out thermonuclear war tomorrow. when I was working at the CIA, there was a consensus that the preconditions for a large-scale nuclear war would be exactly the situation that we are seeing in Europe, a major conventional war in Europe, the involvement of nuclear actors, and there's not just two nuclear actors involved in Ukraine, the United States, Russia, and China. So we have three nuclear superpowers involved over the Ukraine crisis, which wasn't even anticipated in our Cold War calculations about what would likely result in a nuclear war. We see the Russians, if it's true, and the fog of war on the Ukrainian battlefields is thick, people should be skeptical about what they're being told in terms of the Russians losing so badly and all the rest. Almost everything we are hearing is coming from the Ukrainian government that is eager to have NATO and the United States jump into that war. And so they want to make it sound like they're defeating the Russians so badly that we should do exactly that. And there is a growing sentiment in the West for us to do exactly that, which would make it even more likely that this thing would escalate into a nuclear conflict. Because another classical thing on which Washington used to agree, in which there used to be a consensus, when I was working in the agency, in the area of strategic warning and the likelihood of what are the pathways toward a nuclear war, the United States actually getting involved so that we are directly killing Russians, and then if the Russians are on the ropes and it looks like they're really losing, and if Putin's regime is threatened, it's not like when you fall from power in Russia, you get a chance at getting reelected. In these states, political power internally comes out of the barrel of a gun, just as they understand foreign policy in terms of using military force to achieve their goals. Putin, the risks are very high that he and his cohorts would be assassinated, that his family would be killed. He knows that. So if it is true that Russia is in such bad shape, it's really not exactly a cause, even though he's an evil actor and a war criminal, it's not really a cause for celebration. It causes me deep worry, because this man is the national command authority of Russia's nuclear forces, and Russia is the greatest nuclear power in the world by far. Many people in the West don't understand just how great the disparity is between Russian preparedness for nuclear war, the modernity of their forces, the number of their warheads, versus the West. We've been on a nuclear deterrence holiday for 30 years. And we have allowed, that's another thing that's unprecedented. When we thought about during the Cold War, during my CIA days, about the pathways to nuclear war, at least we were operating in a condition where the United States enjoyed nuclear parity with the Soviet Union. We don't have parity with Russia. They have enormous advantages over us in the modernity of their forces. They have at least a 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons, 10-to-1 at least. They probably have a 2-to-1 advantage in strategic nuclear weapons. Even though the State Department stupidly insists that Russia is not violating the New START treaty, it's hard for me to understand how they can believe that when they have violated every other treaty that we have, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention. They admitted last year that the Russians and Chinese have both been cheating on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty for 30 years. It took the State Department until 2020 to finally come out and admit that. Why would one assume that when you look at the delivery capabilities of their missiles, they could easily be cheating on New START and have a 2-to-1 advantage there. And other advantages. They have the world's by far, the most robust national missile defense system, 10,000 anti-missile systems and SAMs that are both nuclear and conventional capable for intercepting our ICBMs, our bombers, our cruise missiles. Hundreds of deep underground shelters that are for their political military elites. They can hide up to 300,000 of their top military political elites in these deep underground facilities that are hundreds of meters deep in solid granite and impervious to nuclear attack. They have shelters and bunkers.
But America does too, don't they?
Pardon?
America does too, don't they?
No, we don't. We don't. We have 64 ground-based interceptors that are not armed with nuclear or conventional warheads. They kill.
Oh, we're losing you. Okay, we're losing. Go ahead, Dr. Pry.
Of these ground-based interceptors. That's all of it in terms of our national missile defense versus their 10,000 anti-missile and anti-bomber and anti-cruise missile systems. 64 versus 10,000. And we have deliberately, as a matter of policy, dumbed down our GBIs, our ground-based interceptors, so that they can't intercept Russian and Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're designed for taking out North Korean and Iranian ICBMs when Iran gets an ICBM. I shouldn't say if. They're very close to having one now. And they're not even really good against the North Korean ICBMs, because it turns out that the North Korean ICBMs are not indigenous, but they've been made with the help of Russia and China. And so they have much more advanced technology than we anticipated. We don't have hundreds and thousands of deep underground shelters and civilian for our political military elites. We've got Cheyenne Mountain, which was designed, it's the NORAD headquarters near in Colorado, and it was designed in the 1950s for atomic weapons. It wouldn't survive a strike by a hydrogen bomb. It would be taken out. We don't have a vast civil defense program and system for our people. Back in 2016, the Russians did a civil defense exercise for a nuclear war that involved 40 million people, sheltering 40 million people. They've got a demonstrated and practiced capability to do that. We don't do that. We don't have shelters for our people, and we don't practice it. So no, it's not true that both sides have the same thing. They have all of these tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons that I'm talking about are new generation systems. Their nuclear forces are, I'm not going to call them deterrent forces, because their nuclear forces are not designed chiefly to deter. They're designed to fight and win a nuclear war. They're designed to make a first strike. That's why, even though the Russian and America both have triads of ballistic missile submarines and bombers and ICBMs, we assume that their triad is just like our triad, but the difference is night and day. Most of their nuclear weapons are on the strategic weapons that could reach us, reach the United States, are on ICBMs. They're what's called MIRV. They carry multiple warheads. And that's because these ICBMs are capable of launching in a few minutes, 24/7, all the time, 365 days a year. They could launch most of their nuclear arsenal against the United States in a matter of a few minutes. We can't do that same thing with our triad, because our triad is designed for deterrence and transparency and what's called crisis stability. We don't want them to be afraid that we even could launch a surprise attack against them. So the smallest part of our triad is our ICBM force. We only have 400 warheads on our Minuteman III ICBMs, which, by the way, were deployed in 1972 and are really almost obsolete at this point. 400 weapons, that's what we've got 24/7, 365 days a year. We've got a couple of ballistic missile submarines on patrol, but most of our submarines are in port, and they are right now. President Biden has not increased the DEFCON level of our forces, which is also unprecedented. Our forces are at DEFCON 5, which is the lowest readiness level. So if Russia attacked us out of the blue today, they could achieve a nuclear Pearl Harbor.
Let me ask you this, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, et cetera, there was something, a deterrent factor called MAD, mutual assured destruction. What has changed now that Russia is opening up the idea that this could go to nuclear war?
It was a conviction of almost religious faith that everybody believed, as the West did, that you can't fight and win a nuclear war. At least this began with the Kennedy administration. Prior to that, under the Eisenhower administration, until we got people from Harvard and Yale who were political scientists, who played war games and thought as intellectuals do about nuclear war, the United States military doctrine was similar to that the Soviet Union used to have. Our military thought, well, nuclear weapons are just a new and more powerful weapon. and you can fight and win wars using nuclear weapons. We had done so in World War II. World War II was a nuclear war. We used nuclear weapons.
But that was against a country that didn't have nuclear weapons to retaliate.
Now, you know what? Most countries in the world today don't have nuclear weapons. So, like Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons. So you can certainly win a nuclear war against a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons. You can probably win a nuclear war. In fact, you can certainly win a nuclear war that doesn't have many nuclear weapons. For example, if the United States and North Korea were to get into a conflict, providing the United States struck first, we would certainly be able to defeat North Korea in a nuclear conflict, or Pakistan in a nuclear conflict, or Russia, if it decided to attack Israel, it could probably defeat Israel, despite the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons, because of the vast preponderance, providing that they strike first. One of the things I learned from many years in wargaming is that he who strikes first wins. Even if you've got only a small nuclear arsenal, there are things you can do with it, like EMP attacks. It only takes one weapon to do a nuclear EMP attack that can paralyze your command and control systems and black out your electric grids and destroy the electronics within your forces. So if the North Koreans did strike first, that's the only way that they could win, or if Israel struck first against Russia or something like that. So any state that acquires nuclear weapons should be regarded as a superpower, because the most fundamental definition of a superpower is, can you destroy other countries utterly? And if you've got nuclear weapons, you can do that if you use them first. And the Russians have played the war games too. They know that. That's why their military doctrine is focused on striking first, and they have postured their forces to strike first. But when the Kennedy administration came along and we brought in the arms control crowd from the universities, their view was nobody could win a nuclear war. These weapons have changed everything. So classical military strategies have to be thrown into the garbage can. We have to think everything anew. And the way to achieve security in the nuclear age is through arms control negotiations and agreements and a common understanding. And the fundamental theory that all of this undergirds is what you had just said, mutual assured destruction. That was a part of our doctrine. And the idea was that neither side should seek superiority. Both sides should have a credible capability to destroy each other. So it would be a perpetual Mexican standoff. That's what America's strategy has basically been based on, or at least it was during the Cold War. And almost as an article of religious faith, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, that the Soviet Union and the Russian General Staff did not accept mutual assured destruction. They never did. That's why they violated all the treaties. That's why we make up excuses that it takes us 20 years to realize and admit that the evidence is so overwhelming that they have violated the treaties. Even to this day, there's an article published today in Foreign Affairs that basically says, oh, don't worry, Ukraine war can't turn into a nuclear war, because everybody knows that you can't win a nuclear war. And even Putin isn't crazy enough to use nuclear weapons. That's Foreign Affairs, the most prestigious US journal. And this, our strategic culture, there's profound differences between our strategic culture and the strategic culture of authoritarian and totalitarian states like Russia, China, North Korea, that I find extremely worrisome, and that I think we could pay the ultimate price because of this difference in our strategic cultures. We in the United States have had a blessed history where we've been protected by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Except for the American Civil War, we never had a major war on our territory. Even during World Wars I and II, we suffered, compared to Russia, for example, very light casualties. We only lost 300,000 people in World War II. Russia lost 30 million dead, and that's dead, not just casualties in World War II. And in fact, they lost many of those people in the very bloodlands where the Ukrainian war is going on today.
I want to ask you this, because I want to get this all out of the way so I can understand and our listeners can understand. If
Sure.
Russia were to attack first, let's say with an EMP that will totally crash the United States electrical system, communications, ability even to maybe retaliate. But I would imagine that the United States has nuclear submarines, has maybe their base in Germany can deliver a retaliatory EMP or other nuclear bombs against Russia. And then wouldn't it be again mutually assured destruction?
No, it wouldn't be, because some of the premises of your statement are incorrect.
Okay.
Sure, we have ballistic missile submarines, but on a day-to-day basis, they're mostly in port. They're not at sea. And unlike during the Cold War, when we had 40 ballistic missile submarines, today we only have 12. We've downsized our forces because we took a nuclear deterrence holiday. And so we basically have about 3 to 4 submarines that are at sea. But the commander of those submarines does not have the authority or the capability of launching his missiles on his own. He has to get an emergency action message from the president. And that doesn't just provide authorization, it provides unlocking codes so that he can fire the missiles, and he has to know where he's firing the missiles at. So he has to get targeting information. These C3I elements are absolutely essential in order for those submarines to operate. And the EMP would take out those C3I elements so that we couldn't talk to the submarines, you couldn't pass emergency action messages. Even if you could, the submarines would be the last thing you've got left to deter an attack on your cities, because the whole point of a Russian counterforce attack, to destroy our ICBMs, to destroy our bombers, to destroy the ballistic missile submarines at port, the next phase is to say, we've disarmed you. If you don't surrender and accede to our demands, we're going to start destroying your cities. And so you can't use those submarines to retaliate, because the whole point of them being there is to provide an assured destruction capability against Russian cities. So we would take that counterforce hit, and that's even if you could communicate with the submarines, which you probably couldn't. If the Russians made an EMP attack against North America, they'd probably do it against NATO too. You could the EMP commission in which I served, we modeled this. If you detonated a super EMP weapon 70 kilometers over NATO headquarters in Brussels, the field would stretch from Ireland to Poland and paralyze all the forces and critical infrastructures across that region. And Russia might be thinking about doing something like that right now as part of its de-escalation strategy. It would entail only detonating a single weapon. And it would be a super EMP weapon, which is the other part of this point. We don't have super EMP weapons. The Russians have developed not just modern new weapons, but a whole new generation called third generation nuclear weapons that do things that the Cold War era nuclear weapons don't. For example, a super EMP weapon is not designed to create a big explosion. It actually has a very low yield. It's designed to put out gamma rays. That's what creates the EMP effect. We don't have that technology in our inventory. All we've got are Cold War era bombs that create big blast effects. Now, any nuclear weapon can create EMP, and we could use a big powerful bomb to make an EMP attack on Russia, but it would only be 50,000 volts per meter, which is the highest EMP level you can get out of a normal nuclear bomb, a nuclear bomb of normal design. And the Russians have hardened their critical infrastructures against that threat. We have not hardened our critical infrastructures against even normal EMP, but a super EMP puts out field strengths that are 2 or 3 times higher than that. So the conditions for mutual assured destruction assumed a condition of parity between the sides, and we maintained or tried to maintain parity during the Cold War. But as I said before, after the end of the Cold War, we went on a nuclear deterrence holiday. And for 30 years, we have not been modernizing our forces. They're exactly the same forces we had under Ronald Reagan and before Ronald Reagan. We don't have these new technologies that the Russians have. And it's not just EMP, but there's a whole array, a family of third generation weapons that are specialized for X-rays, for example. This will enable you to intercept adversary warheads that are coming in, because the X-rays will destroy the electronics in their warheads without creating an EMP over your own territory when you intercept at high altitude. Neutron radiation, very small yield neutron bombs that are available to the Russians so that they They can destroy tank armies and cause very little collateral damage. Ultra low yield weapons that have yields of only the equivalent of 5 tons to 100 tons of TNT. So these things are extremely usable on a battlefield. Air-to-air missiles that are equipped with nuclear warheads. Artillery rounds and tank rounds that are equipped with small, ultra-low yield nuclear warheads. Their navy is a nuclear navy, that's equipped with this array of nuclear capabilities. And we don't have any of that.
I want to ask you, if what you're saying is true, why don't the Russians just do it now? While America has such a weak president and America is not prepared, and they can finally take out their rival that's been a bone in their throat for so many decades already. I mean, why don't they just do it? And let me flip it and say, why doesn't the United States just attack first so they don't have to be attacked and then have to respond and may not be able to respond, and take out this Russian bear who is jeopardizing the security of the entire planet, who is going to be bringing hunger because the breadbasket of Ukraine is not planting this year, and many people are going to die. So we're going to take out the Russian bear once and for all and bring global peace. Explain to me both sides.
Objection.
All right, well, we're going to open up for questions afterwards at the end of the
Okay.
interview. So you can ask your question then. Go ahead,
Okay,
Dr.
thanks.
Pry.
Well, first, they are moving toward their objectives. That's why they invaded Ukraine. They haven't gone nuclear first because one of the virtues of nuclear weapons is that you can win without war. It is one of the ironies of history is that the losers in the last war always learn more and learn the most vital lessons better than the winners do. For example, Russia knows and remembers and is bitter about the fact that they lost the Cold War precisely because the US maintained at least parity in the nuclear balance. One could argue we even had superiority because of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And their economy collapsed because they could no longer sustain the competition with us. And it's unique in history that you had a confrontation between two great superpowers. Normally that does result in a world war, but either through fortune or wise policy, we ended up winning the new Cold War because of our nuclear deterrent, and it prevented it from becoming a global World War III. The Russians are benefiting tremendously right now from their nuclear deterrent. That's why the Biden administration is walking on eggshells and is providing inadequate aid to the Ukrainians and is behind the scenes trying to find some way to de-escalate this conflict and stop this conflict. And I support that they should be doing that. The United States has no vital national interest at stake in Ukraine except ending this war as soon as possible so that it does not escalate into a nuclear conflict. It's the escalatory possibilities of Ukraine that are our chief national interest. I'm not sure Washington really understands that. I asked people to think about how World War I started with little Serbia and a single bullet fired into the chest of an archduke. Ukraine is far more important strategically, and we've got a major war going on. The escalatory possibilities are limitless here. So, Russia, and maybe we should rethink our own assumptions. Are we really understanding correctly what's going on in Ukraine? Because you might well be correct to say, well, if the Russians are losing so badly, how come they haven't used nuclear weapons yet? It could be true that that's the case, and maybe they'll use them tomorrow. But also, it's maybe we have a misunderstanding about what's really happening in Ukraine that's as fundamental and profound as our misunderstanding about the realities of what was happening in Afghanistan. It was a year ago when we're all convinced, that we were going to, well, I wasn't convinced, but most of Washington was convinced that we were going to be able to withdraw from Afghanistan honorably and have a friendly government in Afghanistan, and everything was going to be fine. And this was the result of our intelligence community being in Afghanistan for more than a decade. And we were supposed to have an excellent, perfect understanding of the situation in Afghanistan. And we were wrong about everything. And our military was defeated by the Taliban and chased out in humiliation. So why are we so cocksure that we really know what's going on in Ukraine? I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities that could be happening here. You know, one of the things that comes to my mind is the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, much studied by the Russian General Staff because it was one of Russia's greatest defeats at the hands of Napoleon. Indeed, it was Napoleon's greatest victory, you know, where he had marched his army into Central Europe and he faced the combined forces of Austria and Russia on the battlefield and feigned weakness. He sent defectors over to the Russians and Austrians to tell them, well, we've come so far from Paris that our lines are overextended and the French army is really demoralized. All you have to do is attack and you'll defeat them. You know, he had a whole regiment run away from the Russians to try to convince them to attack, and that all they had to do was come into the battle and they would win. And they were lured into that. And then Napoleon dropped the hammer and he defeated the combined armies of the greatest land powers in Europe, and it made him master of Europe, you know, until he decided to invade Russia. Is it possible? I mean, it's almost like the Russians are trying to provoke us in terms of their bad behavior and all the rest of the bad press. Every day there's some new thing that is provocative and inhumane and that the West really hates. You know, is it possible that the real goal was never to capture the Ukrainian territory, but the highest goal, the real objective here, is to lure the United States and NATO to project power to send our forces into Ukraine so they can then use that 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons to achieve a final solution to the problem of the US and NATO. So, I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but we might be looking right at them doing the very thing that you're asking me.
I want to ask you also about, you were talking about misleading things and the media, what they're reporting, et cetera. And I want to ask you about, how do we know what's really happening on the ground? There are stories of, you know, we see these terrible images of dead bodies with their hands tied behind their back and they were assassinated with a bullet to the head. And look what the Russians are doing. And we see that, you know, they're attacking hospitals, et cetera. But we don't get to hear Russia's narrative because RT News, Russia Today News, has been banned. You can't get it on YouTube. I used to be able to watch it live just to see what was happening, on, you know, what the other side was saying. And, you know, they're not getting what we're getting. And we don't even know what the truth is. So how do you work that out?
Well, you know, you don't make fateful decisions about your country and get yourself involved in a war that could become a nuclear war when you don't know what the truth is. So we need to be extremely cautious. In the article that I wrote on winning the new Cold War in Ukraine, you know, I proposed an action that we should be taking, what I think we should be taking. But the truth, who knows? It may never come out, or I think it'll be some time before we fully understand what's going on in Ukraine, because wars are complicated and it's hard to understand. I mean, you're much younger than I am, but some of your audience may be old enough to remember the Vietnam War and how right up until the 1968 Tet Offensive, you know, we were being told every day that we were winning the war decisively and victory was in sight. And then the Tet Offensive happened, and it set us on the path to losing that war. And we spent at least a decade, you know, trying to reassess, well, what really happened in Vietnam? Getting at the truth is not an easy thing when you're dealing with wars. You're not going to know immediately. You certainly shouldn't be trusting what you hear every evening on the news, especially when the Zelensky government, you know, is trying to manipulate us to come to their defense. And don't get me wrong, I have great sympathy for the Ukrainians. You know, it's a terrible thing to see human rights and human lives being violated, but the West needs to take a hard-headed approach to what really are our interests here. And we have also forgotten, we didn't really get a chance to talk about the history. I was one of the few, when I was on the House Armed Services Committee, my portfolio was NATO enlargement. And I was sent by Congress to visit all the Warsaw Pact states that wanted to come into NATO to see the condition of their militaries, their economies. And I reported back and said, you know, none of these countries is capable of defending itself. Their economies are ruined. The Russians took all their good equipment. That if I was taking a hard-headed strategic approach, not a humanitarian approach to this, But looking at it as a military analyst, I would say, we don't want to bring these countries into NATO, because it's going to be very dangerous for us. We can't defend them. We can't project enough power from European NATO and the United States to defend these countries. The only way we can defend them is with tactical nuclear weapons. And it isn't in America's interests to commit ourselves to a nuclear war for the sovereignty of a country like Latvia or Lithuania, or today, Kazakhstan, for example, is a member of the Partnership for Peace. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all these countries have interim NATO status through the Partnership for Peace. A good guide is never promise to go to nuclear war for a country that most Americans can't find on a map. But that's exactly the situation we've put ourselves in. So it's not like this Ukrainian war has happened in a vacuum. I was just a young congressional staffer, a relatively unimportant person in the power hierarchy. But the Russians cared enough about Ukraine coming into NATO that back in those days, this was back in the George W. Bush administration, the Russian embassy sent a representative to me. And I had an meeting in my office and was warned that if Ukraine came into NATO, it could mean a nuclear war with Russia. So they've been telling us for years that the expansion of NATO eastward is an extremely dangerous thing. It's not like this happened in a vacuum.
I want to ask you this though. I was under the impression that Ukraine did have nuclear weapons and could have used those to defend themselves, but NATO told them to give them up, and that NATO would come to their defense if they needed help. And now we're in that situation, and they're not really getting much help from NATO except for lip service that we have solidarity with Ukraine, and now they're finally sending them some weaponry and things like that. But the sanctions certainly aren't stopping, as I said before, bullets and bombs. Why didn't NATO and the West want to see Ukraine strong with nuclear weapons as a deterrent against Russia?
Well, what you're referring to and what you're saying is true, and it's called the Bucharest Memorandum. And it was a joint memo that was signed by Bill Clinton, President of the United States, by the United Kingdom, and by Moscow, by Russia. And all three of us guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine's borders if they would give up their nuclear weapons. Russia didn't want Ukraine to have nuclear weapons for obvious reasons, all right? And they are notorious for never honoring treaties anyway. Our excuse for not coming to Ukraine's defense is that a memo signed by a president is not legally binding on the United States to come to anybody's aid. I guess the Ukrainians didn't understand that. In the aftermath and euphoria of our Cold War victory, they just sort of had perfect confidence in the honor of the United States and that we would be able to do anything because we had just won the Cold War. And I think Bill Clinton thought that Russia was such a basket case that would never come back as a serious threat. So it was okay to sign that memo. In order for that memo to be legally binding on the U.S. so that we would come to their aid, it would have to have the status of a treaty and be passed through and have the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. And so that's the U.S. legal excuse anyway for not having to honor that. And similar arguments can be made with the British Parliament that the memo was not enough to guarantee that we would come to their aid. On the other hand, is one of the reasons why Russia has conducted this long war in eastern Ukraine that's gone on for 8 years, because basically what they wanted to do is crucify Ukraine, have a long crucifixion of Ukraine to convince the world that US and NATO security guarantees are meaningless. That's another reason for the Ukraine war and the way they've waged it. And that's another reason this might be a war that goes on and on and on a larger scale. Russia likes chaos, unlike us. The West always wants peace, and we're eager to achieve peace. And we just assume that everybody wants that. But Russia, China, North Korea don't think that way. That's why Russia has conducted this war for 8 years in eastern Ukraine. And now another way of understanding this is maybe it wasn't just getting control of Ukrainian territory they wanted, but they decided that they were going to take, instead of the Crimea as the paradigm for how this war would be fought, where they would have a quick and a victory. That's the way we like to fight wars, as bloodless as possible, get the war over as quickly as possible. Another Russian way of war is the way they fought the Mongols and Napoleon and other invaders of their countries. You end up having a long, protracted, bloody thing that goes on because this is a crucifixion of and a demonstration of the uselessness of our security guarantees on a very large scale, a perpetual reminder to the world. And it drives up the cost of oil, which is one of the main sources of Russian income. It drives up the arms sales, which is another major source of Russian income. It gives Putin a reason to unite the people behind his dictatorship, because we're in a war with the West. We've got to pull together and we've got to silence these dissidents. You know, it's an old story. Totalitarians love wars because it enables them to firm their grip. Putin, by the way, in the polls is more popular now, as popular as he was when he took Ukraine. And so the Russian people are behind him. So all of that tends to be working. So we need to question our own, what is the reality in Ukraine? Is it, do we really understand it? I'm just saying this is another example of an alternative outcome. And let me just mention quickly another one. You know, I've mentioned the Austerlitz scenario. I've mentioned, you know, that this is could be an expansion of the Donetsk-Luhansk war into all of Ukraine. But there's another one. And I think maybe Ukraine is, you know, for Russia is like the Spanish Civil War was for Nazi Germany. You know, before Nazi Germany made its bid to conquer the world, you know, it went into the Spanish Civil War to blood its troops, to test its tactics and new technologies. They learned a tremendous amount in the Spanish Civil War.
We lost you again for a moment. Dr. Pry?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now, okay. Nazi Germany learned a tremendous amount from the Spanish Civil War before they made their bid to conquer the world in World War II, and it was and they almost succeeded. Maybe Putin is doing that in Ukraine, and he wants this to be a long war so that he can blood his troops, find out which generals are good generals, which are bad generals, you know, and test the technologies and tactics they have, and learn before going to the big World War III that might be what Russia and China both plan to do. I think they are, frankly, on the verge of doing that. But,
I want to comment on what you said, and then I have one last question, and then I'm going to open it up to our listeners. I do, what you're saying could be true. However, my experience in seeing what unfolds in the world, I don't see things the way that you were explaining them, because at least people that I speak with also, I think that they would agree that the United States is, and I love America. I love the American people. The administrations, unfortunately, I'm not so in love with, because they have interests as well. And they need to sell weapons that makes money. And we saw what happened, like Vietnam was not a short war. And when we went, I'm talking as an American citizen now, to war in Afghanistan to fight and Iraq, etc. That we only just finished recently. That's the 20-year-long hostilities that we were there in Afghanistan, etc. And on top, sorry,
how did those wars work out for us?
They didn't work out well, but that doesn't matter. I mean, because they may have other interests, and I'm not going to go into that now because that's a whole other program. But I want you to know also, as an Israeli and as people who relied on America to be their friend and to have their back and again, I'm not talking about the American people. I'm talking about the administration. We've lost a lot of faith. I think that America has lost an incredible amount of prestige and people to rely and trust in them, because they see what they did in Vietnam, leaving, and they saw what they did in Afghanistan, leaving, and they saw with Ukraine. They gave up their nuclear weapons, and their answer is, you have our solidarity, and we're going to put some sanctions on Russia. I mean, if I were a Ukrainian, I would be appalled that I put my trust in the West, and this is what they're doing in order to defend me. So that's just one thing. But I want to ask you now, and then again, as I said, we'll open it up to our listeners because we want to try to stop in another 15 minutes or so. Where does China come in? And also Iran, which, as you said, also is becoming nuclear, and also Israel. But first, China. Where does China come in?
Well, before I forget in my senility, I do want to quickly say something about Iran. because I think you're right that people shouldn't put their faith in U.S. administrations. I haven't really seen a good president, since Ronald Reagan. George W. Bush was okay, but we seem to be declining in terms of our capabilities to manage the world. America was never really all that great when it came to winning wars overseas and foreign policy. But Iran, I'm about to put out a report, Iran EMP threat. For example, I mean, a lot of Israelis are probably putting great faith in the US estimate that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons yet. I think that's misguided. It's not just me, but a great many senior national security officials from the Reagan administration and from the Clinton administration. We have co-authored articles together trying to warn people that Iran has probably had the bomb for some years now.
Okay, we lost you again. We'll wait a moment. Okay, you're back.
Okay, but here's another area where you shouldn't have faith in what the U.S. intelligence community and State Department tell you about the Iranian threat. We think this report, I'm about to put it out, probably be out next week, called Iran EMP Threat. I think makes the case, explains our reasons why we think Iran has had nuclear weapons for some years and is prepared to make, has the capability to do nuclear EMP attacks, including against the United States. So I think you're right to think for yourselves and not have blind faith in what our intelligence community or our State Department or our administration tells you. They have ideological reasons that are driving a lot of this stuff, that I think have resulted in false intelligence assessments. And so maybe I can send you a copy of that report and you can post it or something when we're done. But China, how does China fit into this? Well, finally, I've been warning for years, as have a handful of others, that Russia and China have been strategic allies for at least a decade. They've signed agreements, they have military exercises together. It was more than a decade ago, Russia and China held a joint nuclear forces exercise where they simulated a nuclear war against the United States over Taiwan. Let's not forget that China is a superpower today, in part because it's stolen technology from the West, but mainly because Russia has helped build them into a superpower by providing them with all kinds of advanced military technology for aircraft, for ballistic missiles, so they've been cooperating together. They are a new axis in the Cold War. Washington has never wanted to acknowledge that. That paradigm is too uncomfortable for them because it means that we're in a new Cold War that we might not be able to win. The combination of Russia and China is a combination of military and nuclear and economic strength that is greater than anything we faced in history in terms of the free world versus the totalitarian powers. And it's even worse than Russia and China because North Korea and Iran are both parts of this new axis. North Korea's nuclear capabilities are built on Russian and Chinese technology. Russia and China want North Korea to be a threat to the United States. Mm-hmm. Have you noticed North Korea never threatens Russia or China? It's always the West that they threaten. North Korea is a nuclear gun aimed at us by Russia and China. It gives them the possibility of waging a proxy nuclear war against us. And this is also true of Iran. Iran wouldn't be anywhere near nuclear weapons if it weren't for the help with their so-called civilian nuclear program that they got from Russia. And Russian and Chinese scientists have helped Iran. There are North Koreans, as we speak, there are North Koreans in Iran helping them with their missile and nuclear program. Most of the Iranians' best missiles, like their Shahab-3, is really a souped up version of North Korea's No Dome. So these guys have been working together for a long time, and they comprise the alternate bloc that faces us. It's been kept secret by them. It hasn't been very public because they benefit from the United States thinking that they are not allied together. But the Ukrainian crisis, at least, has woken Washington up to the fact that China and Russia are strategic partners. but we continue to make huge mistakes by, for example, we're even now, despite the Ukrainian war, trusting Russia to try to help us convince Iran to give up nuclear weapons. Russia is one of the culprits. Russia wants Iran to have nuclear weapons, just like it wants North Korea to have nuclear weapons. We still haven't given up on this idea that we can persuade China to lean on North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. We've been doing that for decades, and it doesn't work because China wants North Korea to be a nuclear threat to us.
Okay, so solution. What is the solution?
Well, what I think Biden should do, and this is a desperate case, is he should mobilize. We don't have time in this crisis to rebuild our nuclear forces. We should, of course, be crashing on modernizing our nuclear forces as much as possible. But what I think the Biden administration should do is they should raise the DEFCON level of our strategic nuclear forces so that they're at a more survivable posture. We should go at least to DEFCON 3 so that Russia couldn't do a nuclear Pearl Harbor on us as they could right now when we're at DEFCON 5. At least go to DEFCON 3. As soon as we start that process, we should use all means necessary to communicate to Moscow, because Moscow isn't taking our phone calls, by the way. The Kremlin isn't talking to the White House. The Russian Defense Ministry isn't talking to the Pentagon. And you would think that they would be if they thought they were losing the war. You'd think they'd be desperate to talk to us to find an exit ramp, but they're not. They've basically cut us off. So we should communicate to them by all means necessary that we've raised the readiness level of our forces. And the reason we're doing it, we don't plan to attack them. We're doing it because they've raised the readiness of their nuclear forces. And so let's both, to avoid a nuclear war, let's both sides stand down our nuclear forces to their normal readiness level. Let's have an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine and try to negotiate a peace based on the peace treaty that Russia offered before it invaded Ukraine. The Biden administration shouldn't have rejected that peace treaty. There are several provisions in that are more in the interests of the United States than they are on Russia. Like not expanding NATO further eastward, for example. We should definitely be doing that, but that's something we could easily agree to. And it could end the Ukraine war, and it would, most importantly, perhaps begin the process of hitting the reset button with Russia so that they would be at least a neutral in the new Cold War with China, hopefully begin a process where we could bring them into our side. Because I think all through the Trump administration, I think Putin was waiting for Trump to hit the reset button. He wasn't able to do it because of all these false accusations that Trump was Putin's puppet and everything. But I think Putin is smart enough to realize that China is a bigger long-term threat to Russia than the West is. And I think he's disappointed that despite everything he's done to build Chinese military power, he hasn't really gotten that much payback. Maybe he's getting that payback now during the Ukraine war because of China's support. But I think it's still possible to basically split the Sino-Russian alliance, and that would isolate China, and it would pull us back from the brink of a third world war at this point, so that the competition between the sides would be at the diplomatic and economic level again, and not at the military level, which is where we stand today. We stand on the threshold of the Ukraine war expanding into a global war, possibly a nuclear war.
So this is interesting what you're saying, because basically what you're saying is that Ukraine would have no say now in the outcome, that America's going to come in, they're going to speak with Russia, how they're going to resolve this, and the Ukrainian people are just going to have to accept it, have to swallow it. Very interesting. Rod, I want you to come back on camera on Spotlight if you can, and read out some of the questions from our listeners for Dr. Peter Pry.
Stand by 1 second while I do that. We have more comments than questions, but we'll kind of go through and scan through them real quick. Starting at the top, it seems that the U.S. has been breaking treaties also. Could you make a commentary on our supporting bioweapons in other countries and the production of bioweapons in other countries?
This is the question about whether the United States has biolabs in Ukraine, for example.
Correct.
Again, the fog of war kind of a thing. I don't, to be frank with you and to be honest, I wish the United States did break some of these treaties. I think the fault of the West is just the opposite, that we adhere to these treaties even when the other side is violating them. I don't know that it's true that we have biolabs doing work in Ukraine. You know, I kind of hope it is, because the Russians have been violating the biological and chemical weapons conventions almost since they were signed. You know, I was present at and ran hearings in Congress approving where we had defectors from the Russian side. You know, and this was more than a decade ago that they've been cheating on these treaties. That doesn't mean the U.S. work in even if it were true that we had biolabs in Ukraine, that doesn't mean the United States was working on offensive bioweapons. You know, we could have been working on defensive bioweapons, which is what we do domestically in the United States, but on a very limited scale. You know, I'm looking at the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty as an example of a treaty. We know the Russians and Chinese are violating it, but we still adhere to it. I think our fault tends to be, look at the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. You know, Russia was violating that for years and years, and it took until President Trump, you know, like 5, 6, 7 years after we knew about their violations before we finally said, well, we can't unilaterally adhere to these treaties. If America's, the biggest fault of America tends to be dysfunctional optimism. That, well, if we just stay with these treaties another year, maybe they'll come back and start obeying the treaties. I mean, that's how we tend to think.
Right, and it's actually not worked out. Let me ask you this question. This actually is coming from my mind and not from a listener. Look, the intelligence community was knocked on their heels by the Russians' lack of preparedness for their equipment, old Cold War era equipment and trucks and weapons. And you see some of them with weapons that date back to the Second World War. How could we have been so, I guess, ignorant of Russia's real capabilities for land warfare?
Well, we may not be ignorant of their real capabilities. You know, we may not be seeing the real capabilities that they have. You know, they're fighting.
I mean, I've heard that, and I asked that. I mean, I have a very close acquaintance that's in the intelligence world, and obviously he can't share, you know, details, but they were gobsmacked. They really thought that they actually had the capabilities that were much higher, and now they're realizing they're really a defunct military, and their reserves are not prepared and trained, and they were just kind of shocked by it. And I find it a little disturbing, to be honest with you. But you mentioned earlier that we've done it in Afghanistan and Vietnam, and you go all the way back to many different wars. Our intelligence agencies seem to miss the mark, and maybe that's just the part of the world that we live in. You can't always get it 100% right.
Well, would you like me to respond to?
Yeah. Oh, yes. For sure. Yes.
Well, I'm not sure that our intelligence community is getting it right when they say, oh, we overestimated the Russian army and we were wrong about that. You know, this is the Biden administration's intelligence community. All right.
I get it.
The Biden administration's intelligence community has every interest in trying to come to the conclusion that threats from Russia, whether they're nuclear or conventional, are much less than what we're assessing them to be, because they don't want to spend money in our own defense budget. They don't want to spend money on our own nuclear modernization programs. It fits in very well with the ideology of the woke left to not spend money on defense. So they love this new interpretation of what's coming out of the Ukraine war. And I think making any judgments like that are premature. You know,
I get it.
It could be that the Russians did not intend to conquer Ukraine in 3 days, which is what the intelligence community assessment was.
Right.
It could be that the Russians are. It could be, and I think that this is likely, but again, the fog of war is here. That they're fighting this war with one hand behind their back. You know, the Russians have got 20,000 tanks. They've only committed, 10% of their forces to Ukraine. They have a huge air force. It was hardly used. The way they started that war, they violated fundamental tenets of their own doctrine, which is really hard to understand. You know, they didn't achieve, they apparently didn't want tactical surprise or strategic surprise.
Right.
They decided to attack under bad weather conditions when the ground was muddy, and it forced the armored to stay the hard roads, so you couldn't go over the fields. Maybe that's all an example of how incompetent the Russian general staff has become, or maybe they never intended to have a quick victory. And what this is all about is trying to convince us that they're weak, that they're pushovers, that we should get involved in the war, just like Napoleon did, during his great victory in 1805. So I don't know, but for sure, maybe you should rethink whether you should trust the U.S. intelligence community when on their assessment that Iran doesn't have the bomb. Okay, because
for sure, I agree.
Important things, right? But you're going to trust them on something that's vital to the existence of Israel.
I think I would trust Israeli intelligence more over the U.S. intelligence.
Of course.
And okay, well, are there any other questions?
There's really not. There are just a number of comments basically that have been.
I see one here from Tar. I think he's in Colorado or Texas. I forget where he is.
He's in Kansas.
Kansas. Okay. He asks here, could one of the United States' allies, if we have any left, he says, can they retaliate an attack on America's behalf?
They could, but would they? Mm-hmm. I mean, the French and British nuclear deterrents are very small. Technically, if the Russians decided not to attack them, and they could attack them, maybe they would, if they were attacking North America, just to be sure they were eliminating them. But if they were to attack Russia on our behalf, it would make themselves targets of Russian nuclear retaliation. Mm-hmm. This is one of the reasons why another Russian demand in their peace treaty was that we remove our tactical nuclear weapons from NATO Europe. All right. I think that's a demand that we could probably easily accommodate, because I don't think those tactical nuclear weapons in NATO Europe are worth anything. Mm-hmm. Most people don't realize that those weapons would not be delivered by the United States. They would be delivered by the host country in which they're based. So can you imagine a situation where, I don't know, Russia has invaded the Baltic states, and we say, Germany, we need you guys to make a tactical nuclear strike on the Russians to save Lithuania. All right. I find it very hard to believe that our NATO allies are going to be willing to make themselves the possible target of Russian nuclear retaliation and actually use those tactical nuclear weapons. This is why Biden's cancellation of the new the Tomahawk successor, it's called the Slickum-N in the United States. It's a new nuclear cruise missile. It was intended to replace tactical nuclear weapons like that so that we could do the strike from attack submarines or destroyers or guided missile cruisers. We would have control over the weapon. But technically, our allies could do that. I don't think they would. I think that once the missiles start flying, our allies would dive under the bed and just want to make sure that they did not get attacked themselves.
Interesting question and very interesting and fascinating answer. Well, Dr. Peter Pry, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the Solomon Sword podcast. I want to thank also Rod Bryant, our producer, for helping produce this show, and to all of our listeners who are coming, and all the listeners who will be watching this on demand later on. We should all be safe. We should all be true and God-fearing and try to be good people and find out what the truth is and do what's right. And we're all brothers and sisters. As I say, whether you're Russian, American, Israeli, we all stem from Noah, and before him, Adam and Eve. We're all brothers and sisters. God willing, we should all get along and see peaceful times. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hey everyone, to make sure you can get access to all of our interviews, make sure to hit the subscribe button on both our YouTube and Rumble channels. Your click makes us all stronger. Thanks.